The scissors struck the floor beside her feet as Lady Millicent seized a fistful of her stepdaughter's hair and hacked through it before the crowded ballroom servants could look away. Candles trembled across the walls while the girl stood frozen beside the staircase, her breathing uneven, her hands shaking around the torn invitation she had hidden for weeks. "You will never be chosen," her stepmother declared loudly. No duke would ever look twice at a girl born from disgrace. But the cruelest part was not the laughter spreading through the hall. It was the silence from the noble guests, pretending not to see her humiliation. Then the great doors opened. Every servant stepped aside at once as Duke Ruthofane entered the manor, carrying rain across his coat and fury across his face. His gaze moved past jeweled daughters, past painted smiles, and stopped on the trembling girl whose hair still lay scattered across the marble floor. And when her stepmother ordered the guards to remove her from the banquet, the Duke did something that left the entire hall speechless. Before I continue, do you think the Duke already knew who she truly was? Or do you believe this was the first moment he had ever seen her? Keep watching to find out. The heavy iron gates of Bramley Hall groaned open as the morning mist clung to the stone courtyard, and Elira Somerset stepped forward with a small basket pressed tightly against her trembling fingers. Her step slowed the moment she saw the banners hanging for the visiting noble ladies, their laughter already spilling like poison into the air. Inside those walls, she knew, decisions would be made about her life, without her voice ever being heard. Lady Millicent Bramley stood near the grand staircase, surrounded by daughters of influence and wealth. Her posture was sharp, her eyes colder than the marble beneath her feet. She did not look at Elira at first, as if the girl were part of the furniture of the hall rather than a living person. Late again, Lady Millicent said at last, her voice cutting through the chatter, "Perhaps you think this house runs on patience." Elira lowered her gaze. "I was helping in the east corridor. The linen room required—" A sharp gesture stopped her. One of Millicent's guests, Lady Harrowan, smiled faintly, studying Elira as though she were something unworthy of name. "She still speaks as though she belongs here," another woman whispered, not even bothering to hide her amusement. Elira felt the words settle into her skin like cold rain, but she said nothing. In Bramley Hall, silence was often the only shield she had left. From the upper landing, footsteps echoed. A group of younger noblewomen descended slowly, their dresses arranged with deliberate elegance, their attention immediately locking onto Elira like predators sensing weakness. Among them was Miss Clarisse Haldon, known across the county for her ambition and sharp tongue. "Well," Clarisse said, circling Elira once, "the adopted shadow still walks among us." A few of the women laughed softly. One tilted her head. "It is almost amusing how she still tries to appear respectable." Elira tightened her grip on the basket. She had learned long ago not to answer cruelty with anger. Anger only fed them. Lady Millicent finally turned her full attention toward her. "Go and prepare the drawing room. We expect important visitors today. Do not embarrass me." Elira bowed slightly and moved away, though every step felt heavier than the last. As she passed the long corridor lined with portraits of Bramley ancestors, she felt their painted eyes judging her in silence. The truth was simple. She did not belong to them. Not by blood, not by favor, not by choice, but the house had never allowed her to forget it. Later that afternoon, whispers spread through the manor like a slow-moving storm. A duke was arriving. Not just any nobleman, but Duke Ruthofane of Hymir, a man whose presence alone had ended arguments in Parliament and silenced entire courts. The news changed everything instantly. The same women who mocked Elira earlier now adjusted their posture, their voices softening into practiced charm. Dresses were straightened, Hairpins were checked. Every movement became a performance of perfection. Elira remained in the corridor, unnoticed, as she polished silver trays for the reception. She had no role in the gathering except invisibility. Yet something in the air shifted when the sound of carriage wheels arrived. From the window, she saw the dark carriage halt at the gates. A tall figure stepped down, his coat trailing slightly behind him, as if even the wind respected his arrival. He did not hurry, he did not hesitate. He simply moved forward, as though the world had already made way for him. Inside the hall, Lady Millicent's voice dropped into urgent instruction. Smile properly. Do not speak out of turn. This is not a village gathering. This is the Duke of Hymir. The doors opened, and silence fell. Duke Rutherfane entered without ceremony, yet every presence in the room bent toward him. His eyes moved slowly across the hall, not lingering on jewels or titles, but searching something unspoken. Elira, still near the corridor arch, felt that gaze pass over the crowd and pause for the briefest moment in her direction. It was gone almost instantly, but it left something unsettled behind. A few of the noblewomen noticed his attention had shifted. Miss Clarisse Haldon, standing near the staircase, followed his line of sight and saw Elira. Her lips curled slightly. That single moment of attention was enough. And in noble society, attention was never harmless. By evening, the guests had gathered in the grand hall. Music began softly, and conversation flowed like polished silk. Yet beneath every smile, tension sharpened. Clarisse leaned toward Lady Harrowen and whispered something that made the older woman glance toward Elira with renewed interest. Elira, unaware of what had begun to form around her, continued her duties near the serving table. But across the room, Duke Rutherfane spoke quietly to Lord Penworth, his voice calm but precise. "Who is the girl near the corridor?" The question did not rise above a whisper, yet it carried weight enough to shift the atmosphere again. Lord Penworth followed his gaze. "That one? She is no one of importance. A charity taken in by Lady Millicent years ago. Some say she is of uncertain origin." The Duke did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes returned once more to Elira Somerset, and this time they stayed longer. Outside the hall, the wind pressed against the tall windows, as if the night itself had begun to listen. In the grand hall, the music continued, yet it now felt strained, as if every note carried a hidden warning. Elira sensed none of it. She only focused on keeping her work steady, her presence small, her movements quiet enough not to draw further attention. But the weight of unseen eyes had already begun to press upon her from every direction. Near the chandelier-lit center, Lady Millicent adjusted her fan with deliberate calm. Her gaze flicked toward the Duke, then toward Elira, and something sharp formed in her expression. She did not like patterns she could not control. And tonight, something about the Duke's silence unsettled her deeply. Miss Clarisse Haldon stepped closer to her circle of allies, her voice low but firm. "Did you see it?" He looked toward the corridor. That girl stood there. Lady Harrowen frowned. It could mean nothing. Clarisse's smile tightened. In this house, nothing means everything. A few of the women exchanged glances. In their world, attention from a man of power was not a blessing. It was a battlefield signal. Across the hall, Duke Rutherfane stood still, yet his stillness was not emptiness. It was an observation. He had learned long ago that truth rarely sat in the center of a room. It lingered at the edges, where people tried hardest to ignore it. He asked another question, quieter this time, directed to Lord Penworth. "You said she was taken in. By whom?" "Lady Millicent Bramley," came the answer. "After some tragedy in her past. Few details are spoken of." The Duke's gaze narrowed slightly, though his face remained composed. "And yet she is treated as a servant." Lord Penworth gave a small shrug. "That is the nature of such arrangements. Charity always comes with conditions. At that moment, laughter rose sharply near the staircase. One of Clarisse's companions pointed subtly toward Elira as she passed carrying a tray of crystal glasses. A whisper followed, then another, spreading like invisible ink through silk sleeves and perfumed air. Elira felt it before she heard it. The shift in attention, the quiet judgment gathering again. But she did not stop. She had learned that stopping only made cruelty grow bolder. Lady Millicent's patience, however, had limits. She signaled sharply. Elira approached. "You will remain near the servants' passage," Millicent said softly, though her tone carried the weight of command. "And do not wander near our guests again." Elira lowered her head. "Yes, my lady." As she turned away, she caught sight of Duke Rutherfane once more. Their eyes met again, but only for a heartbeat. This time, something unspoken passed through the space between them. Not recognition, not understanding. Something closer to disruption. Clarisse noticed it immediately. Her fingers tightened around her fan. Later, as the evening deepened, the guests moved toward the grand balcony where the air was cooler. Conversation shifted into smaller groups. It was there that Clarisse made her move. She stepped directly into Elira's path. "You," Clarisse said softly, loud enough for nearby ears. "You should not be here." Elira paused. "I am only carrying out my duties." A faint smile curved Clarisse's lips. Duties belong to those who are meant to be seen performing them. The surrounding women gathered closer, forming a quiet circle of attention. Lady Harrowen stood at the edge, watching without interference. Lady Millicent remained nearby, silent but alert. From the far end of the balcony, Duke Rutherfane observed the gathering without moving. Clarisse took one step closer. "Tell me, girl, what do you think you are doing in a house filled with names greater than your own?" Elira met her gaze briefly. "I am doing what I was told." A ripple of laughter passed through the group, but before it could grow further, the Duke spoke from behind them. "Enough." The single word did not rise in volume, yet it cut through everything. Every head turned, and Elira, standing at the center of attention she never sought, realized that whatever came next would not leave her life unchanged. Every breath in the hall seemed to pause as the Duke stepped forward, and Elira felt her fate begin to shift in ways she could not understand. The word from the Duke carried across the balcony like a closed door being shut on laughter. No one spoke for a moment, not even those who had been prepared to mock. Duke Rutherfane stepped further into the circle, his presence changing the air itself, as if the night had tightened its breath. Elira stood still where Clarisse had cornered her, unsure whether to step back or remain. The silence around her felt heavier than words. She had faced ridicule before, but never silence that came from power itself. Clarisse was the first to recover. She lifted her chin slightly, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Your Grace, I meant no disrespect. I was only correcting a misunderstanding within the household." The Duke's eyes shifted to her. Calm, measured. "Correction is not your place here." A flicker of embarrassment passed through Clarisse's expression, but she forced composure. Then perhaps the household should maintain clearer order. It is difficult when individuals without standing are placed among guests of rank. Lady Millicent stepped forward at once, sensing danger in the air. "Your Grace, forgive any disturbance. We are merely preparing for your comfort. This young woman is of no concern to matters of importance." Elira's fingers tightened slightly at the word young woman, as if it erased her name completely. The Duke did not look at Millicent immediately. His attention remained on Elira. Is that how she is always spoken of in this house? A silence followed, sharper than before. Millicent hesitated. She has her duties. Nothing more is intended. "Duties do not remove dignity," the Duke replied quietly. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Words like that did not belong in polite gatherings. They belonged in judgments that changed lives. Clarisse stepped closer again, her voice soft but sharpened by control. Your Grace may not be aware of her history. It is said she arrived here under uncertain circumstances. No lineage confirmed, no proper family record. The Duke turned slightly. And who confirmed such certainty? No one answered. Elira lowered her gaze. She was used to being described without ever being asked. From the edge of the balcony, Lord Penworth observed carefully, sensing that something larger than gossip was forming. He had seen courts shift from far smaller moments than this. Clarisse pressed on, encouraged by silence. We only mean to protect reputation. Society is delicate. One misplaced presence can alter perception of an entire household. The Duke's expression remained unchanged. Then perhaps society is more fragile than it should be. A few restrained breaths moved through the group. Millicent's hand tightened on her fan. Elira felt the attention slowly shift again. Not away from her, but around her. As if she had become the center of something she did not understand. The Duke finally turned his full attention to her. Come forward. The words were simple, but they struck the space like command. Elira hesitated. Every instinct told her to remain where she was, yet refusal felt heavier than obedience. Slowly, she stepped forward until she stood a few paces from him. Up close, his presence was even more imposing, not in size, but in certainty. "What is your name?" he asked. A pause followed before she answered. "Elira Somerset." A faint shift passed through the nearby guests, as though the name itself was unfamiliar yet worth remembering. "Somerset," the Duke repeated, slowly. Clarisse's eyes narrowed slightly. Millicent's expression tightened. The Duke continued. "How long have you been in this household?" "Since I was a child," Elira answered carefully. "I was taken in after my parents passed." "By whom?" "Lady Millicent Bramley." A silence followed that carried more meaning than words. The Duke turned slightly toward Millicent. "You accepted guardianship." Millicent straightened. It was an act of responsibility. "Responsibility," he repeated, as if testing the word. Then his gaze returned to Elira. "And you have been treated as staff since then." Elira did not answer. There was no version of the truth that needed repetition. Clarisse stepped in again, unable to let the moment settle. "Your Grace, surely this is not of concern. Many households employ wards in similar ways." The Duke looked at her briefly. "I did not ask for your explanation." The words landed cleanly. Clarisse's lips pressed together, but she said nothing further. Lady Harrowan finally spoke softly from behind. "Your Grace, perhaps this matter is not suited for public discussion." The Duke turned slightly toward her. Then it should not have been made public behavior. A subtle discomfort spread through the group. The evening, once intended for elegance, had begun to fracture under a tension it could not control. Elira felt it most sharply. She had spent years learning how to remain invisible. Now invisibility was no longer possible. The Duke studied her for a longer moment. Then he asked, "Have you ever been formally presented to society?" A faint hesitation. "No." "Ever been given a season, an introduction, or patronage?" "No." Each answer seemed to deepen something unspoken in his expression. Clarisse stepped forward again, unable to accept her loss of control. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly, she has never been considered suitable for such things." The Duke finally turned fully to her. "And who decided suitability?" The question silenced her. For the first time, Clarisse did not respond immediately. Millicent moved closer, lowering her voice. "Your Grace, I assure you this discussion is unnecessary. The household is under my care." The Duke's gaze shifted to her. "Then, explain why she stands apart from every guest in your care." Millicent opened her mouth, then closed it again. No answer formed quickly enough. A quiet tension spread through the balcony. Guests began to realize that the Duke was not merely observing. He was questioning the structure itself. Elira felt the weight of it pressing inward. She did not understand why any of this mattered to him. Then, unexpectedly, the Duke spoke again, softer this time but directed only to her. "Do you choose to remain here?" The question startled her more than anything else that had been said. "I have no other place," she answered honestly. Something changed in his gaze at that moment. Not sympathy, not pity, something sharper. Before anyone could react, Clarisse let out a small, controlled laugh. "Your Grace, you cannot be serious. She is bound by circumstance, nothing more." The Duke did not look away from Elira. Circumstance can be rewritten. That sentence caused a ripple through the gathered guests. Millicent stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace, this is not appropriate conversation for such an evening." The Duke finally turned toward her fully. "Then perhaps this evening has revealed more than it was meant to." A silence followed that felt like judgment without announcement. Elira looked down, unsure where she now belonged in the shifting attention. The Duke took one step closer to her. "Elira Somerset," he said again, as if confirming something. "You will remain within my notice for the duration of my stay." Clarisse's expression tightened sharply. Millicent's composure fractured slightly. Elira did not speak. She only felt the ground beneath her life becoming uncertain in a way she had never experienced before. And somewhere in the distance of the hall below, whispers had already begun to form into plans. Plans that would not leave her untouched. After the Duke withdrew from the center of the gathering, the guests slowly broke apart. Yet no conversation returned to its earlier ease. Every group now spoke in lowered tones, as if the walls themselves might repeat their words. Clarisse stepped away from the circle with a stiff smile, but her eyes no longer held irritation alone. Something colder had formed, a calculation that did not leave room for mercy. Lady Millicent remained still, near the balcony rail, watching Elira from a distance that now felt unfamiliar. The household she controlled had shifted without permission, and that alone unsettled her more than public embarrassment. She called one of the senior attendants close and spoke in a whisper, ordering increased supervision of Elira for the remainder of the Duke's stay. Elira, unaware of the instruction, moved back toward the inner corridor. Each step felt heavier, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. She could feel the change in how people looked at her. It was no longer dismissal. It was attention shaped into suspicion. In a quieter hall near the library doors, the Duke paused alone for a moment. He had not left the estate entirely, choosing instead to observe the movement of the household from a distance. Lord Penworth approached him carefully, respecting the silence before speaking. "There is unrest forming within your interest," Penworth said gently. The Duke did not turn. It was already present. I only made it visible. Penworth studied him, and the girl, a brief pause followed. She does not yet understand what she stands in the center of. Meanwhile, Clarisse gathered two of her closest allies in a side chamber. Her voice was low but steady. "He has taken notice of her. That cannot be allowed to settle." One of the women frowned. "What can we do without drawing his attention?" Clarisse's expression sharpened. "We do not act against him. We act around her. Reputation is shaped by suggestion, not confrontation." Outside the chamber, footsteps passed without stopping. Elira, carrying folded linens, moved through the corridor unaware that her name was already being reshaped in private tongues. That night, Elira stood by her small room window, sensing unseen plans forming around her, while the distant estate lights flickered, carrying secrets she could not yet name fully changing. The morning after the Duke's arrival did not feel like morning at all. It felt like a room that had been left slightly open through the night, allowing cold air to settle into every corner of Bramley Hall. Elira noticed it first in the servants' hall, where conversation stopped the moment she entered, not fully silent, but carefully adjusted, as if every voice had been taught a new caution overnight. She held a tray of folded linens and moved toward the corridor, yet no one met her eyes. Even those who had once ignored her now seemed to watch her differently, as though she had become a subject of interest rather than invisibility. In the upper sitting room, Clarice Halden stood with two companions. A letter lay open on the table before them, written in careful ink. Her expression was calm, but her fingers tapped lightly against the paper. "It must be done properly," she said. Not loudly, not carelessly. A suggestion is more powerful than an accusation. One of the women hesitated. "And if the Duke questions it?" "He will not question what appears already accepted," Clarice replied. "That is how society survives itself." The second woman glanced toward the corridor, and the girl, Clarice's smile was faint. She will not even know she is being spoken about until it is too late. Downstairs, Elira paused near the library doors when she heard her name spoken from within, not loudly. Just enough to catch her attention through instinct alone. Inside, Lady Millicent Bramley sat with Lord Penworth and another visiting matron, Lady Harriston. Papers were arranged neatly on the table between them. Elira could not see clearly, but she recognized Millicent's controlled tone, even through the wood. "She has always been difficult to place," Millicent was saying. "We have treated her with fairness, but there are limits." Lady Harriston responded softly. "It is unfortunate when generosity creates misunderstanding." Elira felt a small unease form in her chest, though she did not yet understand why. By midday, whispers had begun to circulate with more structure. Not random remarks anymore, but shaped stories, the kind that begins without origin and ends without proof. Elira was called to the storage chamber by an attendant she did not recognize well. The woman avoided eye contact. "Lady Millicent requires you to bring down a set of silver records," she said. "They are needed for inspection." Elira nodded and went without hesitation. The chamber was dim, lined with wooden shelves and locked cabinets. She located the records carefully, placing them into a cloth wrap. As she turned to leave, she noticed another bundle already prepared on the table near the corner. It was unusual, unlabeled. Before she could consider it further, footsteps approached from behind. "Leave that," came a voice. It was Clarice. Elira turned slightly. "I was instructed to take only the records." Clarice stepped into the chamber, followed by one of her companions. Her expression was composed, almost gentle. Instructions change quickly in households like this. Elira tightened her grip. "Then I should confirm with Lady Millicent." "That will not be necessary," Clarice replied smoothly. "She is occupied." The companion stepped closer, subtly blocking the doorway. Elira hesitated. Something about the situation felt arranged, not accidental. Yet, refusing direct instruction was not something she had ever been allowed safely. Clarice walked past her and lightly adjusted the bundle on the table. "Take both. It will save time." Elira obeyed, though unease lingered as she left the chamber. That evening, the estate gathered again in the main hall, this time for a smaller private audience requested by the Duke. The atmosphere was less decorative, more restrained. Conversations were minimal. Even the music was softer, as if unsure of its place. Duke Rutherfane stood near the centre, speaking briefly with Lord Penworth, while observing the movement of the household staff. Elira entered from the side corridor carrying the wrapped bundles, unaware that several eyes followed her path more closely than before. Clarice stood near the stair column with two ladies. One of them whispered, "It is ready." Clarice gave a slight nod. At the appointed moment, Lady Harriston raised her voice gently. "Your Grace," she said, stepping forward. There is something that should be addressed before the evening proceeds further. The Duke turned toward her, calm but attentive. Lady Harriston gestured toward Elira. We have become aware of irregular handling of estate property. A subtle shift passed through the room. Elira paused mid-step, uncertain whether she had been directly addressed. Millicent straightened immediately. What is the meaning of this? Clarisse stepped forward as if reluctant. It is not our intention to create disturbance. However, items from secured chambers were seen being moved without proper authorization. Elira felt her grip loosen slightly on the bundle. Lord Penworth frowned. What items? Lady Harriston replied carefully. Silver records along with additional sealed documents. A murmur spread. Millicent's gaze turned sharply toward Elira. That is not possible, Millicent said. She would not have access. Clarisse's voice softened. We did not assume intent, only observation. Elira finally spoke quietly. I was instructed to retrieve them. A brief silence followed. Clarisse tilted her head. By whom? Elira hesitated. An attendant. The attendant was immediately called forward. She arrived pale and confused. Clarisse addressed her gently. Did you instruct her to take both bundles? The attendant looked startled. I only said the records. A pause. Clarisse turned slightly toward the Duke. Your Grace, this is exactly the concern. Conflicting instructions, missing clarity, and unsecured access. The Duke's expression remained unreadable. Millicent stepped forward again, her voice firm. This is a misunderstanding, nothing more. But Lady Harriston interjected softly. Misunderstandings still require accountability. Elira stood still, feeling the structure of the moment shift around her. Something had been added to the truth without her knowledge. Clarisse continued. We also found that certain documents were temporarily unsealed before being returned. That alone raises concern. Elira looked down at the bundle she held. Her mind raced. She had not opened anything. She had not touched anything beyond what she was instructed. Yet the way they spoke made it sound otherwise. The Duke finally moved. He stepped closer, stopping a few paces from Elira. The room quieted instantly. Place them down, he said gently. Elira obeyed. The cloth was opened carefully by an estate clerk. The silver records were examined first. Then the second bundle. A faint pause followed from the clerk. These seals appear disturbed, he said quietly. Elira's breath caught. I did not open them. Clarisse sighed softly, as if burdened by reluctance. We are not accusing directly, only presenting what has been observed. But observation was enough. In rooms like this, suggestion often carried more weight than fact. Millicent's face tightened. She turned slightly toward Elira. Explain yourself. Elira's voice remained steady, though strained. I did not touch anything beyond what I was given. Lady Harriston spoke again. Then someone must have. A pause. Clarisse added, or perhaps misunderstanding has deeper roots. The Duke raised a hand slightly. Silence returned. He looked at Elira directly. Did you enter the storage chamber alone? Yes, she answered. Did anyone accompany you? No. A faint shift moved through the crowd again. Clarisse stepped forward slightly. Then access cannot be denied. Elira's eyes widened slightly. I was told to go there, but no one accompanied you, Clarisse replied softly. The implication settled slowly, carefully placed like a weight. Millicent's voice sharpened. This is becoming unnecessary. But the damage had already begun forming in the room's perception. The Duke remained silent for a long moment, studying Elira. Not with accusation, not with comfort, with something closer to analysis. Then he spoke. Who instructed the storage request? The attendant answered nervously. I was sent by the household authority. I assumed it was Lady Millicent's order. Millicent stiffened. That is not true. Clarisse lowered her gaze slightly. It appears confusion originated at multiple points. Elira felt it now. The structure closes around her slowly, not through force, but through alignment of voices. The Duke finally spoke again. "Remove the records from circulation until clarity is restored." The clerk nodded quickly, but Clarisse added softly, "And what of trust within the household?" No one answered. Elira stood alone in the center of uncertainty, realizing something painful. She had been placed inside a story she did not write. And as the Duke's gaze lingered on her once more, longer than before, she understood that whatever came next would not only question her actions, but begin to question her very place in the house that had raised her without belonging elsewhere. The morning after the accusation did not bring relief. Instead, it brought structure, not the kind that protects, but the kind that confines. Elira Somerset woke to find the household no longer treating her as invisible, but as uncertain. Servants who once withheld care now stepped aside with hesitation, as though proximity alone could be dangerous. A notice had been placed near the inner corridor requesting her presence before Lady Millicent at the first hour. No reason was given. No explanation offered. Only expectation. Elira arrived quietly, hands folded, posture steady, though her mind carried the weight of unanswered questions. Inside the chamber, Lady Millicent sat with Lord Penworth and 2 estate advisers. Clarisse was already present, composed and patient, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Millicent did not look up immediately. When she did, her voice carried controlled disappointment. "Elira yesterday placed this household under scrutiny." Elira kept her gaze lowered. "I did not act against instruction." Clarisse tilted her head slightly. "Intent is not the only matter under consideration." Lord Penworth placed a folded document on the table. "There are inconsistencies in access logs. Your presence is recorded near restricted storage at the relevant time." Elira's heart tightened. "I was sent there." Millicent's tone sharpened. "By whom?" Elira hesitated. "An attendant." Clarisse stepped in softly. "An attendant acting without confirmation of authority creates instability. That is the concern." Elira felt the shift again. The words were not direct accusations, but they built shape through repetition. Lord Penworth continued, "Until clarity is established, your access to internal chambers will be suspended." A pause followed. Elira nodded slowly. "I understand." But understanding did not soften the silence that followed. Clarisse rose gently, smoothing her sleeve. "It is unfortunate, but necessary. Reputation must be preserved before doubt spreads further." Millicent finally looked at Elira directly. "You will remain within assigned quarters until further notice." Elira gave a small bow and left without protest. As she moved through the corridor, she sensed that something had changed permanently. Not removed, but repositioned. She was still within the house, yet no longer within its trust. Outside, the estate grounds were unusually active. Carriages arrived and left in shorter intervals than usual. Guests who had extended their stay after the Duke's arrival now spoke in low tones near the garden paths. The source of that tension became clear when Elira saw him again. Duke Rutherfane stood near the West Gallery, speaking briefly with Lord Penworth. His presence remained unchanged, steady and composed, but his attention shifted the moment Elira appeared at the corridor arch. He ended his conversation and approached her without hesitation. Millicent, who had been nearby, stiffened slightly at his movement. Clarisse, observing from a distance, narrowed her eyes. The Duke stopped a few steps from Elira. "I have reviewed what was presented," he said calmly. Elira waited. His gaze did not soften, but it did not accuse either. "You have been restricted." "Yes," she answered quietly. A pause followed. Then he asked, "Do you accept that decision?" Elira hesitated. "I do not understand what I am meant to defend against." The Duke studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Clarisse stepped closer from behind, voice gentle but deliberate. "Your Grace, the household has acted responsibly under uncertainty." The Duke did not turn. Uncertainty is not proof. Millicent approached, careful but firm. "Your Grace, we cannot ignore irregularities simply because they are uncomfortable." His attention shifted briefly to her. "Nor can we define truth through discomfort alone." Silence followed. Elira stood between them, feeling the weight of both judgment and observation without belonging to either. The Duke turned back to her. "Who benefits from your removal from trust?" The question was unexpected. Elira frowned slightly. "I do not know," Clarisse answered smoothly. "The household benefits from clarity. No single individual should disrupt order." The Duke's gaze remained on Elira. "That is not what I asked." A faint tension passed through the surrounding space. Millicent's voice tightened. "Your Grace, this discussion is becoming unproductive." He finally turned toward her. "What I see is a pattern forming faster than explanation." Clarisse stepped forward again, careful in tone. "Patterns can appear where none exist when attention is focused." The Duke replied simply, "Or when they are placed deliberately." A brief silence followed that felt heavier than all previous arguments. Elira felt a subtle shift in how the room now moved around her. Not toward clarity, but toward division. Later that afternoon, she was assigned to the outer work corridor, a quiet form of removal disguised as duty. She was no longer permitted near internal archives or administrative spaces. Her movement was limited, her tasks reduced. Yet even in isolation, she felt watched. In the upper sitting room, Clarisse met again with Lady Harriston and another noble guest. A second document lay open on the table. "This must be reinforced," Clarisse said. "Subtle reinforcement only. Repetition without direct claim." Lady Harriston nodded slowly. "And the Duke?" Clarisse's eyes narrowed slightly. "He is not easily guided, but even he responds to structure over time." The second guest hesitated. "And if he continues to question her innocence?" Clarisse's smile was faint. "Then innocence becomes irrelevant. Perception will have already settled." Downstairs, Elira passed through the corridor carrying linens when she overheard fragments of conversation through a partially open door, not directed at her name, but close enough that instinct forced her to pause. "She cannot remain within influence," one voice said. "Not while his attention persists," another replied. Elira stepped back silently, continuing her path without entering the room. That evening, the estate hosted a smaller gathering in honor of the Duke's continued stay. Music returned, but more restrained. Conversations were carefully measured. Elira was not invited to attend, yet her absence was still felt in indirect references. During the gathering, Clarisse positioned herself closer to the Duke's line of sight than before. She spoke lightly with other guests, occasionally ensuring her words carried toward him. Millicent observed this carefully, tension building behind her composed expression. At one point, Clarisse spoke deliberately within earshot of the Duke. It is unfortunate when households must correct internal instability while under external observation. The Duke turned slightly. Correction assumes error has been identified. Clarisse responded softly. Sometimes identification follows necessity rather than certainty. His gaze remained steady. Then necessity becomes dangerous when used without truth. The exchange ended without resolution, but the atmosphere shifted again. Later, as guests dispersed, Elira was called unexpectedly to the inner hall. This time, the summons came directly from Lord Penworth. When she arrived, the Duke was already present. Millicent stood at one side, arms folded. Clarisse remained slightly behind her. Composed but attentive, Penworth spoke first. "A review of access points has been completed." He placed a document on the table. "Certain entries indicate that the storage chamber lock was opened twice within a short interval. Elira frowned. I was there once. Clarice spoke gently, which raises concern about the second entry. Elira turned slightly. I do not know about a second entry. The Duke stepped forward slightly. Who else has access? Millicent answered carefully. Only senior staff and authorized household members. Clarice added, which includes individuals who may not always be accounted for during transitions. A pause followed. The implication hung without direct statement. Elira felt her chest tighten. Are you saying someone else used my access? No one answered directly. Instead, Penworth said, We are saying the records are incomplete. The Duke looked at Elira again, more directly now. If you did not perform the second entry, he said, then someone did so using your position. Elira shook her head slightly. I did not authorize anything beyond what I was told. Clarice stepped forward softly. That is precisely why clarity is needed. Millicent's tone sharpened. This is becoming endless speculation. The Duke raised a hand slightly, stopping further argument. He turned toward Elira. Until truth is separated from arrangement, you will remain under observation. A quiet shift passed through the room. Not punishment, not released, something in between. Elira lowered her gaze. Clarice's expression remained composed, but satisfaction flickered briefly in her eyes. As Elira was dismissed from the hall, the Duke's voice followed her softly. Do not assume silence means absence of attention. She paused briefly, but did not turn, and behind her, she could feel the household continuing its quiet restructuring around her name, while one figure refused to let her disappear fully into it. The declaration did not come with a warning. It came in the middle of a formal assembly at Bramley Hall, where guests had gathered under strict invitation and even stricter expectation. The air was polished with etiquette, but beneath it, tension had been building for days. Elira Somerset stood near the rear corridor as usual, assigned to quiet duties that kept her presence small and unnoticed. Duke Rutherfane arrived later than the others. No announcement preceded him. No ceremony announced his entrance. Yet the moment he stepped into the hall, conversation bent toward him, like metal drawn to unseen force. His coat carried the weight of travel, his expression unchanged from the days before, but something in his eyes had settled into decision. Lady Millicent straightened immediately. Clarice Halden, standing near the stairline, watched without blinking. Elira felt the shift before she understood it. The Duke was no longer observing. He was acting. He stopped at the center of the hall, without waiting for an invitation. The room gradually quieted, confusion replacing polite speech. I have listened long enough to interpretations of this household, he said calmly. No one interrupted. His gaze moved once across the gathered guests, then settled briefly on Elira at the edge of the corridor, and I find them insufficient. A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. Clarice stepped forward slightly. Your Grace, this is a private gathering. If concerns exist, they may be addressed through proper channels. The Duke did not look at her. Proper channels have already been used to cloud clarity. Millicent's voice tightened. We have only maintained order. Order without truth is control, he replied. A silence spread through the hall. Elira stood still, sensing something irreversible forming. Then the Duke spoke again. Elira Somerset is under my protection from this moment forward. The words did not echo. They settled. For a moment, no one reacted. Not because they did not understand, but because they were deciding how to respond. Clarissa's composure fractured slightly. Your Grace, that is an extraordinary statement. It is a precise one, he replied. Millicent stepped forward. She is not of standing to be placed under such a declaration. The Duke turned toward her. Standing is not inherited through assumption. The hall remained silent, every guest now fully aware that something had shifted beyond repair. Elira felt her breath tighten, not in relief, but in confusion. Being named openly by him did not free her. It exposed her further. Clarisse's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, her control slipped into urgency. She exchanged a brief glance with Lady Harriston at the side of the room. A decision had already formed before anyone else spoke again. That night, while the estate remained unsettled by the Duke's declaration, movement began in quieter corners. Servants were sent with messages that carried no official seal. Doors were opened and closed without notice, and Elira, now under visible attention, became the center of unseen correction. She was instructed to remain within her assigned chamber until further notice. The instruction came from Millicent directly, her tone controlled but strained. "You have created a situation beyond your understanding," she said. Elira stood near the doorway. "I did not ask for any of this." Millicent's expression hardened. Intent does not erase consequence. Outside, footsteps passed frequently. The household no longer moved normally around her. It circled. Later that evening, Clarissa met with Lady Harriston in a secluded sitting room. A single document lay open between them, its contents carefully arranged. "It must appear natural," Clarisse said. Lady Harriston nodded. "The timing will matter more than detail. And the man? He has agreed to observe. He understands the benefit." Clarisse's smile was faint. "Then we proceed." Outside the estate, a visiting gentleman of minor noble connection had been brought into the plan. He was not of influence, but he was enough to create suggestions. Enough to build doubt where clarity had begun to form. The next afternoon, Elira was asked to deliver correspondence to the West Pavilion. The request was unusual, but not explicitly forbidden. The attendant who delivered the instruction avoided eye contact. "You are expected promptly," she said. Elira hesitated briefly, but obeyed. The path to the pavilion was quieter than usual. The gardens stretched still and controlled, trimmed with precision that felt almost artificial. As she approached the structure, she noticed a carriage nearby, partially concealed behind hedges. She slowed. Before she could turn back, a voice called softly, "Elleria Somerset." She turned. A man stood near the pavilion entrance, well-dressed, composed, unfamiliar. His posture suggested awareness rather than surprise. "I was told you would arrive," he said. Elira frowned slightly. "I was sent here for correspondence." He nodded slowly. "That is one version of the instruction." Unease formed immediately. She stepped back slightly. "I do not know you." He hesitated. "That is expected." Before she could respond further, distant footsteps approached from the side path. Elira turned instinctively. Clarisse appeared first, followed by Lady Harriston and two attendants. Their arrival was too coordinated to be accidental. Clarisse's expression was calm, almost regretful. "I am sorry you had to be brought into this," she said gently. Elira looked between them. Into what? The man near the pavilion stepped slightly closer, just enough to be visible beside her. Not touching, not confirming, only present, Clarisse continued softly. "We hoped it would not come to this level of exposure." Elira's voice tightened. "Explain what you are doing." Lady Harriston spoke carefully. "We are addressing concerns that have already reached the Duke's attention." Elira felt something shift inside her chest. "This is not real." Clarisse lowered her gaze slightly. Perception rarely requires reality to function. The man remained silent, as instructed. Elira turned sharply. "You are using him to create a false assumption." Clarisse did not deny it. "Instead," she said, "we are preserving the household from instability caused by misplaced attention." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Elira turned again. Duke Rutherfane had arrived. He dismounted without haste, eyes immediately assessing the scene. His gaze moved from Elira to the man beside her, then to Clarisse and the others. No immediate reaction followed. He simply observed. Clarisse stepped forward. "Your Grace, this appears to be an unfortunate misunderstanding. We received reports that this gentleman had been seen in private communication with Elira Somerset." Elira's breath caught. "That is not true." The Duke did not respond immediately. He walked slowly forward, stopping a short distance from all of them. His gaze remained on the man. "Your name," he said calmly. The man answered. A pause. Then the Duke asked, "Have you met her before today in private circumstances?" The man hesitated. Clarisse spoke softly. "Your Grace, this is not necessary." "Answer," the Duke said. The man nodded slightly. "I was asked to meet her." Silence followed. Elira turned sharply toward him. "That is not true." Clarisse stepped in gently. "We only arranged a controlled interaction for clarity." The Duke's gaze shifted slowly back to Elira. No accusation, no comfort, just observation. "You were brought here without prior knowledge," he said to her. "Yes," she answered quickly. He looked at the man again. "And you were instructed to appear as if familiarity existed." The man did not respond. That silence was enough. Elira felt her chest tighten, not in panic, but in realization of how carefully the situation had been built around her absence of control. The Duke stepped closer. "Leave," he said to the man. The instruction was immediate. No debate followed. The man hesitated, then withdrew. Clarisse's expression remained composed, but tension had entered her control. Millicent arrived, moments later, having been summoned by disturbance. She took one look at the scene and understood enough. "This must stop," she said sharply. The Duke turned slightly. "It already has." Clarisse spoke quickly. "Your Grace, you cannot ignore what has been presented." "I am not ignoring it," he replied. "I am rejecting its construction." A silence followed. Elira stood still, her hands clenched at her sides. She had not cried openly, but her eyes carried strain from repeated exposure to accusation. The Duke turned fully toward her now. "You are not defined by arrangements made in your absence," he said. Clarisse's voice softened, almost carefully, "and yet perception will remain." The Duke replied, "Then perception will be corrected." He extended his hand slightly, not to touch her, but to signal presence beside her. Elira did not move immediately. The weight of everything made even small motions difficult. But she stepped closer, not toward comfort, toward alignment. Behind them, Clarisse watched with restrained frustration, already adjusting her next move. Millicent stood rigid, realizing control of the household was slipping into external authority, and Elira, though shaken, understood one thing clearly. Being claimed by the Duke did not end the battle. It only changed who was willing to fight openly against her. The estate had changed in ways that could not be hidden anymore. What began as whispers had become structure, and what began as doubt had become division. Elira Somerset no longer moved through Bramley Hall as an unseen figure. Every corridor now acknowledged her presence, even when silence followed her steps. Duke Rutherfane had not left since the day he exposed the arranged deception near the pavilion. Instead, he remained within the estate's orbit, attending matters that once belonged only to Millicent Bramley's control. His presence was no longer a visit. It was an occupation of attention. Clarisse Halden had grown quieter, but not defeated. Her silence carried calculation. Lady Harriston and others who had supported the earlier scheme now adjusted their distance, sensing that influence had shifted beyond recovery. Elira, however, felt no victory. She felt exposure, even with the Duke's protection. Her name had been pulled through too many interpretations to feel safe. One morning, she stood near the corridor window when Millicent approached. Her steps were slower now, less certain. "This household is no longer what it was," Millicent said, Elira did not respond. Millicent continued, "And neither are your circumstances." Elira turned slightly. "I did not ask for change." Millicent studied her. "Few people ever do." Outside, the Duke arrived again without announcement. His carriage halted with precision, and within moments his presence reached the main hall. Elira was called to meet him. She arrived in the central hall, where light fell through tall glass panes. The Duke stood near the staircase, speaking briefly with Lord Penworth. When he saw her, he dismissed the conversation and stepped forward. "There will be a formal gathering tonight," he said. Elira hesitated. "Another assembly?" "Yes," he replied, "but this one will not be for observation." Clarisse, standing at a distance, watched closely. Millicent remained near the side columns, her expression unreadable. That evening, Bramley Hall transformed into a structured brilliance of controlled gathering. Guests arrived under invitation, but the tone was different. Less curiosity, more expectation. Elira was guided to the upper chamber before the event began. Attendants prepared her carefully, though no excess detail was allowed to define her appearance. Her hair, already cut short from earlier humiliation, remained simply arranged. When she descended, the hall quieted slowly. Duke Ruthven stood at the center. He stepped forward as she reached the lower steps. Then he spoke clearly. "Elira Somerset will no longer be spoken of as uncertainty within this estate." A pause spread through the room. He continued. "She will be recognized under my protection and intent for lawful courtship." The hall reacted in visible shock, though restrained by etiquette. Clarisse's face tightened sharply. Millicent froze briefly. Elira felt her breath pause, not from joy, but from the weight of declaration. The Duke did not stop, and any prior attempt to misrepresent her position will be treated as interference with declared intention. Silence followed. No one spoke immediately. Then Clarisse stepped forward. "Your Grace, this changes the established structure within the county." The Duke turned slightly. Then the structure required correction. Millicent finally spoke. "You cannot override household governance so easily." His gaze remained steady. "I do not override. I replace what has failed." Elira stood still, her hands clenched gently. She had become the center of a decision that no longer allowed retreat. Days passed. The estate stabilized into uneasy order. The Duke's presence became routine, yet his attention toward Elira remained consistent, measured, and public in a way that prevented further concealment. Clarisse withdrew gradually from visible influence. Lady Harriston left the estate within the week, followed by others who had supported the earlier arrangement. Some left quietly, others left with visible discomfort. Millicent remained, but her authority had thinned. Elira found herself no longer assigned to isolation tasks. Instead, she was included in controlled appearances, always within view, always acknowledged. The courtship progressed slowly, not through intimacy, but through recognition. The Duke ensured her presence in matters of estate discussion, where her opinion, though limited, was now heard rather than ignored. Months passed. During that time, Clarisse sent a letter. It contained no defense, only departure. She had chosen to leave the county entirely, citing the irrelevance of continued presence. Lady Harriston followed later, offering a brief apology delivered through written word rather than meeting. The changes were not dramatic in sound, but they reshaped the estate completely. One evening, the Duke met Elira in the garden corridor. He said simply, "The courtship period is complete in form." Elira looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he replied, "the decision is no longer subject to external approval." She understood then that what had begun as a tension had become permanent. The wedding was arranged without a spectacle of excess. It took place in the estate chapel, attended only by those who remained after the departure of others. Elira walked forward with steady steps. Her short hair remained unchanged, simple and unadorned. The Duke stood waiting. No dramatic words were exchanged beyond formal vows, no gestures beyond necessity. But the declaration was final. She was no longer under observation. She was no longer under suspicion. She was recognized as his lawful wife within title and standing. After the ceremony, the estate did not erupt in celebration. Instead, it settled into calm acceptance. Those who had doubted earlier now remained distant. Those who had participated in manipulation were no longer present. In time, Elira stood again at the corridor window where she had once been watched in silence. Now the silence felt different. Not empty, defined. The Duke joined her there. He said nothing at first. Neither did she. But the absence of uncertainty was louder than any accusation that had come before. The story that once tried to erase her had ended by placing her at the center of recognition. And for the first time, Elira Somerset did not feel rewritten by others. She felt established. Months later, when the estate records were finalized, her name remained unchanged. But its meaning had shifted permanently within the county, no longer questioned, no longer rearranged, simply acknowledged. And when visitors occasionally returned to Bramley Hall, they no longer asked who she was. They asked instead how everything had changed so completely, because the woman they once tried to erase had become the name the estate could no longer speak without respect. If you had witnessed her standing alone during those early accusations, would you have stepped forward or remained silent? Do you think the household changed because of truth, or because power finally intervened? And in a world where reputation decides fate, would you have trusted Elira's silence, or the voices speaking against her? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below now.